Well, hello, and welcome to Wisdom Wednesday. It has been a few weeks since we've had a Wisdom Wednesday video come out, but we are back at it here on October 25th, looking through Proverbs 25, more sayings of Solomon applying to our lives for daily wisdom that we might live in a way that honors God and is wise before those around us. In verse 8, Solomon writes, "What your eyes have seen, do not hastily bring into court, for what will you do in the end when your neighbor puts you to shame?" And we see this interesting thing that Solomon discusses here. When we see something, we should have a level of patience and assessment and time to figure out why something is happening the way it is. Sometimes what happens is we react really quickly to things that we see, not understanding the totality of the backstory or the forward moving story that's coming with it. And when we live in a culture that demands us to be quick to judge, it can look very foolish when in a few weeks or months or years we have to eat some of those words. And it can be actually something where we allow our pride to not allow us the humility to be able to move beyond some of the hastily judged things that we've decided. There's been a number of times when I've worked in youth group ministries or as a parent of multiple kids, where you see the reaction of someone else without knowing the backstory as to what's happened. And just like a referee in a sporting event, they might not see the totality of what's happening. They see a defined moment, then they need to make this decision based on who gets a penalty for what reaction. And you're like, well, is this penalty a retaliation? Is it the initial action that has caused a reaction? And there's all these nuances that come in. And Solomon here in verse 8 says, "Let us not be hasty in these things, but let us take a moment and assess, analyze, and understand some of the reactions and actions that have taken place to land us where we are." Might not always be the case, but it is definitely something that we should strive to do so a little bit more often, is to have patience to understand the backstory. And when we do that, we actually give people a greater opportunity to be able to walk through the purposes and reasons for why a certain action was taken. For example, this could be a great tool for parenting. If your kids are having a dispute over something, and one reacts or acts in a way that you think is not the most appropriate, rather than hastily disciplining or chastising them for their actions, taking a moment to walk through the process and the thought patterns that brought them to why they felt that reaction was warranted, will bring you lots of opportunity for revelation and opportunity for further discussion as to maybe where that thought process got off track to get to the result that you saw. And I'm not saying I'm great at that. That's something I'm working on as well, something I'm trying to recognize a little bit more in my own life. And maybe it can be something that you add into your life when we see things that are maybe not the way we think they should be. Asking these questions of how and what was the thought process along this line. Now, a lot of that has to do with the relationships we have with people and the way in which we communicate and respond to them. I can have those conversations with my kids because at the end of the day, my kids know that I love them deeply. And so there is a process to that that can be very helpful. Solomon goes on to say that when we are hasty in doing these things, often we'll experience shame later on, and maybe not because of that specific thing, but because when we are hastily pointing out in judgment the wrongdoings of others, we need to be very well aware that we too have wrongdoings. And when our life is put into a fishbowl, it becomes a moment where now all of a sudden, are we living in a particular manner because we are deeply convicted about that integrity, or because we're just scared that we too will one day be pointed at and say, you have made this mistake as well? And so when we think about what it means to not hastily bring these judgments, these words of accusations, or these things to the general court, be it Facebook or Instagram or legitimate court systems that we have in Canada or wherever you are, then we have these moments where we can offer grace and discipleship in a much deeper and realer way. And this is a really valuable lesson to learn. A little bit lower, he says that with patience a ruler might be persuaded, and a soft tongue will break a bone. And this is just a continuation of this thought. You catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. And when we are willing to walk alongside one, not bring quick judgment, not be quick to anger, but be patient and slow to it, then in that we can begin to hear the thought processes that cause people to think, act, and move in particular ways. Solomon also, through chapter 25, speaks in verse 6 and 7, as well down in verses 16, this idea of when we not putting ourselves into positions where we think we belong without being invited. Don't put yourself in the king's presence, but rather it is better to be invited into that place. Like clouds and winds without rain is a man who boasts about a gift that he never gives. And in verse 25, if you have found honey, eat only enough for yourself, lest you have your fill and vomit it out. And we see this trajectory that Solomon is going of like, don't perceive yourself as more than you are, nor present yourself as more than you are. Allow others to come up with that notion of who you are rather than you telling them who you are. The one who boasts about a gift or a skill set or what they're going to do and never follows through eventually becomes untrusted. And that's not a sign of a wise person. A wise person is someone who speaks with integrity, who lets their yes be yes and their no be no, and walks in a way that is wise daily. Not boasting about a gift, but one who refreshes those they speak to. This is extremely important. Another thing here that I think is important to discuss is found in verse 19. And it says, trusting a treacherous person in times of trouble is like a bad tooth or a foot that slips. And there are many moments in our lives where we face challenges and difficulties, and we are presented with a quick fix or a long but sustainable fix. And often that quick fix might cause us to have a lack of integrity. That quick fix might be placing our trust or signing an agreement, shaking of hands, a verbal affirmation of an individual or of an entity that no longer or doesn't represent well the integrity that we are trying to live by. And so when challenges come, it is easy and human nature to look for the simplest, quickest, easiest solution, not the one that brings the most life throughout the longevity of the challenge being solved or overcome. And so Solomon reminds us and causes us to consider in this moment that in times of challenge, in times of difficulty, in times of problem, the shortcut or the simplest solution might not be the best one. It might cause us to feel like a bad tooth or a foot slipping. If you've ever had an ongoing toothache, it lasts and it just bothers you constantly all the time. It causes you to not eat well and not sleep well and not talk well and be grumpy. And Solomon is likening that taking the shortcut, taking the simplest solution by agreeing to do something that is perhaps not full of integrity, will cause us to live as if we have a toothache constantly. It'll be guilty on our conscience, heavy on our shoulder, compressing on our chest. And the only way to remove that is to bring it in before the Lord, forgive, repent, and then change our direction and our ways in which we move. And if we find ourselves in one of these situations where we have signed agreements, perhaps monetarily or a quid pro or whatever on I'll do this if I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. Solomon actually speaks either in other places in Proverbs that we should not do those anyways, but if we have found ourselves in those places, we need to do whatever we can to get out of and fulfill to the best of our abilities with integrity those terms of the agreement. So I'm going to leave those with you, those thoughts with you today. Thank you so much for joining us for Wisdom Wednesday. We'll see you next week.